In the summer of 1456, the most powerful empire on earth gathered its full might outside the walls of Belgrade. 100,000 Ottoman soldiers, 400 cannons, and a fleet stretching across the Danube. Behind those walls stood only a fraction of that force, knights without reinforcements, a 70-year-old priest, and thousands of peasants armed with farming tools. Europe had abandoned them. No kings came, no armies marched. The Pope could only offer prayers, and yet, when the Ottomans breached the walls and poured into the city, something happened that no sultan, no strategist, no empire could have predicted. The peasants charged, not to retreat, not to negotiate. They charged straight into the heart of the Ottoman army, and by nightfall, an empire that had never known defeat was running for its life. In the year 1453, the unthinkable happened. Constantinople, the great Christian city that had stood for over 1,000 years as the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, fell to the Ottoman Turks. The news spread across Europe like a plague of despair. Churches held masses for the dead. Kings and princes whispered behind closed doors about what this meant for their own kingdoms. For centuries, Constantinople had been the shield between East and West, a fortress city that had repelled siege after siege, invasion after invasion, and now it was gone. Sultan Mehmed II, only 21 years old when he breached those ancient walls, had earned a title that sent tremors through every throne room in Christendom. They called him the Conqueror, and he was not finished. Mehmed made no secret of his ambitions. He spoke openly of marching his armies to Rome itself, of planting the Ottoman banner above St. Peter's Basilica, of completing a conquest that would make him ruler of both the old Roman Empire and the new. To many in Europe, this was not empty boasting. This was prophecy unfolding before their eyes. The Ottoman war machine seemed unstoppable. Their armies were vast, disciplined, and battle-hardened. Their cannons were the largest the world had ever seen. Their navy dominated the eastern Mediterranean, and now their gaze turned north, toward the heart of Europe. Standing directly in their path was a single fortress city called Belgrade. It sat at the place where two great rivers met, the Sava flowing from the west and the Danube rolling down from the north. Any army wishing to march into Hungary, and from there into Austria, Germany, and beyond, would have to pass through Belgrade. Military strategists called it the key to Hungary. If that key fell into Ottoman hands, the door to Central Europe would swing wide open. And yet, as this existential threat gathered on the horizon, Europe could not bring itself to act. The continent was fractured by old rivalries and fresh wounds. The Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick III, offered prayers but no soldiers. France and England were still recovering from their own bloody conflicts. The Italian states squabbled among themselves, each hoping the storm would pass them by. Hungary itself was in chaos. The king was a boy of 13, and the nobles, who should have been raising armies, were instead scheming against each other for power and influence. Only one voice cut through the paralysis. Pope Calixtus III, an elderly Spaniard who had taken the papal throne just a year before Constantinople fell, issued a desperate call for a new crusade. He sent letters to every Christian ruler. He ordered church bells to ring at noon as a call to prayer and a reminder of the danger. He promised spiritual rewards to any who would take up arms. But the response was pitiful. The great crusading armies of centuries past did not materialize. The kings did not ride forth with their banners. Europe, it seemed, would watch Belgrade fall the same way it had watched Constantinople fall, with grief and horror, but without action. Into this void stepped two men who had no business leading a defense against the greatest military power on earth. The first was John Hunyadi, a Hungarian nobleman and general who had spent his entire adult life fighting the Ottomans. He was now in his 60s, old for a soldier in that brutal age, his body worn by decades of campaigns and battles. He had won famous victories and suffered bitter defeats. He had seen the Ottoman threat grow year by year while Europe slept. Now, with perhaps one campaign left in him, he gathered what forces he could and marched toward Belgrade. The second man was even more unlikely. Giovanni da Capistrano was a Franciscan friar, 70 years old, thin and weathered by a life of fasting and prayer. He had never led men in battle. He carried no sword, but he carried something else, a voice that could make crowds weep, and a faith that burned with absolute conviction. For months he had traveled across Hungary, preaching in town squares and village churches, calling on ordinary people to take up the cross. And they came, not trained soldiers or armored knights, but farmers and shepherds and craftsmen. They came with scythes and axes and clubs, with whatever they could find. They came because an old priest told them God was calling them to save Christendom. By the summer of 1456, this strange army had gathered near Belgrade, professional soldiers and peasant crusaders, a legendary general and an aged holy man. It was not the force anyone would have chosen to face the conqueror of Constantinople, but it was the only force that came. And as the summer heat settled over the Hungarian plains, dust clouds appeared on the southern horizon. The Ottoman army was coming. On the 4th of July, 1456, the horizon south of Belgrade turned dark with the advancing Ottoman host. What approached was not merely an army, but the full might of an empire bent on conquest. 100,000 soldiers marched in disciplined columns, their banners catching the summer wind, their armor glinting beneath the sun. Behind them rumbled hundreds of cannons, including the massive siege guns that had shattered the walls of Constantinople just 3 years before. On the Danube itself, a fleet of Ottoman warships stretched across the water, sealing off the city from any hope of resupply or escape. Sultan Mehmed II had come personally to oversee the destruction of Belgrade, and he had brought everything necessary to ensure that this fortress would fall as Constantinople had fallen. Inside the city, the garrison numbered perhaps 7,000 professional soldiers under the command of Mihaly Silagi, a hardened warrior who understood exactly what they faced. These men watched from the walls as the Ottoman camps spread across the landscape, like a dark tide, surrounding Belgrade on every side. They could count the enemy banners, they could see the siege guns being positioned. They knew the mathematics of their situation, and the mathematics offered no comfort. Outside the walls, camped on the hills overlooking the city, waited Hunyadi with his relief force and Capistrano with his peasant crusaders. Together they numbered perhaps 20,000, but many of these were farmers who had never held a weapon before answering the friar's call. They too watched the Ottoman army arrive, and many must have wondered what they had marched into. When the bombardment began, the earth itself seemed to tremble. Day and night, the Ottoman cannons roared without rest. Stone walls that had stood for generations began to crack and crumble. Towers that had overlooked the confluence of rivers for centuries collapsed into rubble. Dust filled the air so thick that the sun appeared dim, even at midday. The defenders could do little but take cover and pray, rushing to repair breaches that appeared faster than they could be filled. Sleep became impossible. Food grew scarce. The dead were buried in shallow graves within the city because there was nowhere else to put them. Hunyadi understood that the city could not survive much longer under this punishment, but he also understood that a direct assault against the Ottoman army would be suicide. His only chance was to break the naval blockade on the Danube, to open a lifeline that could bring supplies and reinforcements into Belgrade before the walls gave way completely. On July 14th, he launched his attack. The battle on the river was unlike anything the Ottomans expected. Hunyadi had gathered every boat he could find, from proper warships to fishing vessels to crude rafts. He sent fireships drifting into the Ottoman fleet, their hulls packed with pitch and oil, flames leaping into the summer sky. As the Turkish ships scrambled to avoid the inferno, Hungarian vessels rammed into them from unexpected angles. Soldiers leaped from deck to deck, fighting hand to hand above the churning water. The Danube ran red with blood. Ships burned and sank, men drowned by the hundreds. For hours the battle raged, chaos spreading across the river as smoke and screams filled the air. And then, impossibly, the Ottoman line broke. The Turkish fleet retreated downstream, leaving the river open. Christian boats immediately began ferrying supplies and fresh fighters into Belgrade. For the first time in weeks, the defenders felt something other than despair. Hunyadi himself entered the city, embracing Silagi and surveying the damage to the walls. The situation was grim, but not yet hopeless. The naval victory had enraged Mehmed beyond measure. He had never suffered such a humiliation, and he would not suffer it long. He ordered his commanders to prepare for a full assault. No more waiting for the walls to crumble completely. They would storm Belgrade with overwhelming force and drown its defenders in blood. On the night of July 21st, the final Ottoman assault began. The bombardment intensified to a fury that made everything before seem gentle by comparison. Then the cannons fell silent, and in that sudden terrible quiet, the Janissaries advanced. These were the elite soldiers of the Ottoman Empire, slave soldiers trained from childhood for war, disciplined and fearless, and utterly devoted to the Sultan. They poured toward the breaches in the walls by the thousands, screaming battle cries that echoed across the burning city. The garrison met them in the rubble. Fighting erupted in every breach, on every pile of shattered stone, in every narrow street beyond the walls. Steel clashed against steel in the darkness. Men died grasping at enemies they could barely see. The professional soldiers of Belgrade fought with the courage of those who know there is nowhere left to retreat. But there were simply too many Janissaries. For every one who fell, 3 more climbed over his body. The breaches widened. Ottoman soldiers began flooding into the city itself. Street by street, the defenders were pushed back. Silagi sent desperate messengers to Hunyadi, reporting that they could not hold much longer. The city was falling. The Janissaries were inside, and on the hills outside Belgrade, Giovanni da Capistrano received the news. He looked at the peasants gathered around him, farmers and shepherds clutching their crude weapons, their faces lit by the distant fires of the burning city. And in that moment, the old friar made a decision that defied every principle of military strategy. He raised the crucifix he carried and ordered the peasants to charge.
Throughout the siege, Giovanni da Capistrano had kept the peasant crusaders on the hills outside Belgrade. He knew they were not soldiers. He knew they had no training, no armor, no understanding of military formations or tactical discipline. They had come because they believed God had called them, and Capistrano had told them to wait, to pray, to trust that their moment would come. But as he watched the fires spread through Belgrade, as messengers brought word that the Janissaries had breached the walls and were flooding into the streets, the old friar understood that waiting was no longer possible. If the city fell tonight, there would be nothing left to save by morning. Every principle of military wisdom said that sending untrained peasants against elite Ottoman infantry was madness. Every calculation of odds and armour and experience pointed to slaughter, but Capistrano was not a general, he was a priest, and he believed with absolute certainty that God had gathered these people here for exactly this moment. He raised the crucifix high above his head so that every peasant on the hillside could see it silhouetted against the burning sky. He cried out that the Lord who made the beginning would take care of the finish. And then he pointed toward the city and ordered them forward. What happened next defied every expectation of how battles are supposed to unfold. Thousands of peasants surged down the hills toward Belgrade, screaming prayers and battle cries in equal measure. They carried scythes, still caked with harvest dust. They carried axes meant for splitting firewood. They carried clubs and hammers and sharpened stakes and whatever else they had brought from their villages. Many carried nothing but their faith and their fury. They ran toward the breached walls with a momentum that could not be stopped, a human tide crashing toward the Ottoman forces who had thought the battle already won. The Janissaries inside the city turned to face this new threat and found themselves confronting something they had never encountered. These were not professional soldiers who could be outmaneuvered. These were not mercenaries who might break and flee when the fighting grew desperate. These were farmers who believed they were doing God's work, who feared eternal damnation more than any earthly death, who fought with the wild abandon of those who had already committed their souls to heaven. The peasants crashed into the Ottoman lines in the breaches, and the chaos became total. There was no order, no formations, no strategy. There was only a swirling mass of bodies in the darkness, steel against steel, screams against prayers, the living climbing over the dead to reach their enemies. The Janissaries were the finest infantry in the world, but they had already fought for hours through the streets of Belgrade. They were exhausted, their ranks had been thinned by the desperate resistance of the garrison, and now this fresh wave of maniacs was pouring into them with an intensity that seemed inhuman. John Hunyadi had been fighting in the city when the peasant charge began. At first, he could not believe what he was seeing. This was not how battles were supposed to be fought, but Hunyadi was above all a pragmatist, and he recognized opportunity when it appeared. He rallied his professional cavalry and led them in a thundering charge against the Ottoman flanks. Suddenly the Janissaries found themselves caught between the peasant horde in front and Hungarian horsemen slashing into their sides. The tide of battle, which had seemed so clearly in Ottoman favour just an hour before, began to turn. What happened next changed everything. In the chaos of the melee, an arrow or crossbow bolt struck Sultan Mehmed II himself. The wound was to his thigh, painful and bleeding, but not mortal. Yet in the darkness and confusion, word spread through the Ottoman ranks like wildfire. The Sultan was hit, the Sultan was down, the Sultan might be dead. For an army built entirely around devotion to one man, this was catastrophic. The discipline that had made the Janissaries unstoppable began to crack. Officers who had been coordinating the assault suddenly found their men looking backward instead of forward. Units that had been pressing the attack started to hesitate. And in war, hesitation is the first step toward disaster. The hesitation became withdrawal. The withdrawal became retreat. And the retreat became a rout. Ottoman soldiers who had entered Belgrade as conquerors now fled through the same breaches, trampling their own comrades in their desperation to escape. The peasants and Hunyadi's cavalry pursued them without mercy, cutting down the fleeing enemy in the streets, in the rubble, beyond the walls, across the fields that surrounded the city. What had been an organized assault dissolved into a mass of terrified men running for their lives. The killing continued through the darkness and into the dawn. The Christian forces, their blood up after weeks of helpless suffering under bombardment, showed little inclination toward mercy. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers died in the pursuit. Thousands more were captured. The camps that Mehmed had established with such confidence were overrun and plundered. Cannons that had shattered the walls of Belgrade were seized as trophies. Banners that had flown above 100 victories were trampled into the mud. When the sun finally rose on July 22nd, it illuminated a scene of utter devastation. The Ottoman army that had arrived with 100,000 soldiers was broken and fleeing south. Tens of thousands lay dead across the battlefield. The greatest military power in the world had suffered its most humiliating defeat in living memory, and Belgrade still stood in the ruins of the city among the rubble and the bodies and the still smouldering fires. The peasant crusaders did what they had done before the battle. They knelt and they prayed. They were covered in blood and ash. Many were wounded. Many would discover in the coming hours that brothers and fathers and sons had fallen beside them. But they had done what no one believed possible. Farmers with scythes had broken an empire. The silence that settled over Belgrade that morning was unlike any silence before. It was the silence of exhaustion beyond measure. It was the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of men who had walked into the valley of death and somehow walked out again. The battle was won. But as the survivors would soon learn, victory carries its own terrible costs. In the days following the great victory, a different enemy crept silently through the Christian camps. The fields around Belgrade were strewn with unburied dead, both Ottoman and Christian. The summer heat accelerated decay. Flies swarmed in clouds so thick they darkened the air, and in this festering landscape, plague took root and spread with terrifying speed. Soldiers who had survived the fury of Janissary blades began to sicken and die in their tents. The hospitals filled faster than the priests could administer last rites. What the Ottoman army had failed to accomplish, disease now threatened to complete. On August 11th, barely 3 weeks after his greatest triumph, John Hunyadi succumbed to the plague. The White Knight who had spent a lifetime defending Christendom, who had orchestrated the naval victory and led the decisive cavalry charge, died not on the battlefield, but on a sickbed, burning with fever. He was 60 years old. He had given everything for Hungary and for the faith, and in the end he did not even live long enough to see the full Ottoman retreat. Across Europe, bells that had rung in celebration now tolled in mourning. Giovanni da Capistrano continued his work among the sick and dying, refusing to abandon those he had led into battle. He ministered to plague victims, prayed over the dead, and tried to hold together the remnants of his peasant crusade. But the disease did not spare even saints. On October 23rd, the old friar who had raised the crucifix and sent farmers charging against an empire breathed his last. He was 70 years old. He had preached the crusade, led the impossible charge, and witnessed the miracle he had promised. Now he was gone. The two men who had saved Belgrade, the warrior and the priest, the general and the holy man, would never see the lasting peace their sacrifice had purchased. Hunyadi left behind a son named Matthias, who would one day become one of Hungary's greatest kings. Capistrano left behind a legend that would lead to his canonization as a saint of the Catholic Church. But in the autumn of 1456, there was only grief and the smell of death and the cruel knowledge that victory and loss are often separated by nothing more than a few weeks of fever. The defeat at Belgrade shattered something essential in the Ottoman advance. For 70 years, the empire that had seemed destined to swallow all of Europe turned its attention elsewhere. The road to Hungary remained closed. Austria and the German states, which had done nothing to help Belgrade in its hour of need, were given decades to strengthen their defences and prepare for future conflicts. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the strategic one. Before Belgrade, the Ottomans had seemed invincible, a force of nature that could not be stopped, only delayed. After Belgrade, Christian Europe understood that the Conqueror could be beaten, that his Janissaries could be broken, that faith and courage could sometimes triumph over numbers and cannons. This knowledge would sustain resistance for generations to come. Pope Calixtus III had ordered church bells to ring at noon as a call to prayer before the siege began. When news of the victory reached Rome, he decreed that the noon bell should continue ringing forever as a memorial to those who had saved Christendom. To this day, in Catholic churches around the world, bells still ring at noon. Most who hear them do not know why, but the tradition endures, an echo of that summer morning in 1456 when the impossible happened. In Hungary, the battle became a cornerstone of national identity, proof that a small nation standing at the crossroads of empires could defy the greatest powers on earth and survive. The names of Hunyadi and Capistrano entered legend. The peasants who charged with their scythes became symbols of what ordinary people can accomplish when they refuse to accept defeat. History sometimes turns on moments like these, not on the decisions of emperors or the movements of vast armies, but on the choices of individuals who have no logical reason to hope, yet choose to fight anyway. On a summer night in 1456, thousands of farmers stood on the hills outside a burning city. They had no armor, they had no training, they had no military reason to believe they could prevail against the finest soldiers in the world. But an old priest raised a cross and told them that God was with them, and they charged. They charged into the darkness and the fire and the waiting blades of the Janissaries. They charged because they believed. And because they charged, an empire that had never known defeat learned what defeat felt like. Because they charged, the gateway to Europe held for another lifetime. Because farmers with scythes refused to be afraid, the course of history bent in a direction no sultan had foreseen. The cannons are silent now. The walls have been rebuilt and crumbled and rebuilt again. The men who fought that night have been dust for centuries. But if you listen closely at noon, you can still hear the bells. And in that sound, faint but unbroken across 500 years, you can hear the echo of the morning when the peasants saved Europe.